We're in Judges chapter 7, verse 16, if you want to turn there again in your Bibles. And today we're going to talk about war strategy. And we've done this before, going through the book of Joshua and all that entailed as the Israelites went into the Promised Land. But we'll review some of those lessons again today. Now, history records many unorthodox battle strategies and surprise victories. Most ultimately still do involve strategy, a little bit of luck, capable leaders and willing soldiers. So when you read of, say, the Battle of Thermopylae, it's very famous, where the 300 Spartans held off the Persian army for 3 days and allowed for an opportunity for the Greek nations to band together, we understand that this was something of a combination of grit, luck, strategy, determination. When we read of Hannibal's ginormous victory against the Roman legions, whereas he had the smaller force and yet somehow managed to encircle a much larger Roman force, we do chalk it up to a little bit of luck, perhaps, but there was certainly Hannibal's brilliance and strategy, a group of willing soldiers who had actually traversed some of the hardest and harshest of circumstances just to get to the Roman Italian peninsula. But still, it fell short of being something that you might call beyond any logic to explain in terms of victory. Anything that you might call divine providence and presence. This is reserved for Scripture and for the battles that we often see, especially in these pages of Joshua and Judges, where the battle simply defies any kind of human strategy or human luck. There are divine interventions at work, and this is in order that we might see, for those who trust God, our strategy doesn't always make sense. Now, it doesn't mean our strategy never makes any sense. I certainly hope that there are moments in your day where you rely on logic and experience and wisdom passed on to you in order to make the decisions of your life. But ultimately, God's strategy is faith. And so we'll see what that looks like, faith and obedience. And there are times certainly when faith and logic, they just go hand in hand. But it's always logical to obey God. We'll get there in just a moment. So let's read the text together, and then we will go through it verse by verse as we normally do. Now, just for a little bit of context, remember Gideon has been asked by the Lord to lead Israel's troops into battle, quote unquote, against the Midianites who have been oppressing the Israelites for 7 years now. And Gideon was told that his force of 32,000 men was too large to come against the Midianites, who numbered 135,000. And so through a process of whittling down the number of men, we've come to the magic number, not magic, the divine providential number of 300 men that God would use to defeat the Midianites. Remember, we talked last time how Gideon was still a little bit uncertain, and so he gets an insight into what's going on in the camp of the Midianites just prior as two men discuss a prophetic dream, actually, that one of them had, that indeed Gideon and his armies would come and conquer this very large and overwhelming force. And so we read verse 16, and he, Gideon, divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars. And he said to them, "Look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and shout, 'For Yahweh and for Gideon.'" So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch. And he blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, "A sword for Yahweh and for Gideon." every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, Yahweh set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beit Shittah toward Zererah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them, as far as Beit Barah, and also the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beit Barah, and also the Jordan. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeeb they killed at the winepress of Zeeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon across the Jordan. Then the men of Ephraim said to him, "What is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they accused him fiercely. And he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. Tonight we're going to go over 3 strategies that the Lord would have us employ in our life of faith. 4 strategies that Christians would do wise to study, just as soldiers and generals go to war college and study the strategies of previous battles. So Christians have the Word of God to go through and study the strategies that have brought success to those who have gone on before. And the first is this, that the strategy is faithful obedience. That's always the strategy. Faithful obedience. If Adam and Eve had been faithfully obedient, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. And so for the lack of it, humanity was thrust into years, generations of sin and death and strife. And so God is...
I'm trying to check the...
Yeah.
Is it necessary?
I think we're okay. Yeah, I think we're okay. The audio's working, right? So,
Yeah.
So the strategy is faithful obedience, and we see here that Gideon takes the 300 men who are set aside by the Lord, and they are split further into 3 different companies, probably 100 each. Gideon, we see in verse 19 there that he leads 100, so you would surmise that another group is 100, another group is 100. And their armament consists of what? Trumpets and empty pitchers or jars. Now, the trumpets here, don't imagine like a brass instrument trumpet. These are shofars or ram's horns that they would use, and we used to have one in here. I don't know where it is, but next time I'll bring it and you can have a listen. I'm probably not as good as Bob was when he blew it. I'll practice this week. But they get quite loud. And of course, the sound of it would have been intimidating when you hear 300 of them going off in the hills around you. The point of them is noise making, not melody making. And in battle, a horn could be used, as they have been used in many armies throughout time and history, to communicate in battle because they are so loud and you could signal with them. So if in an army only the leaders, let's say, had these horns to communicate, you wouldn't have a whole lot of horns on the battlefield because that would confuse you. Well, 300 of them would sound like a very large army. So certainly that figures into what's going to happen next. But each one of them is given one of these shofars or horns, and then they're given empty jars. And they're called empty jars because normally what you would find in them is water or some kind of liquid. But these are holding torches. And the point of that is so that their light is not obvious to those who are near the torches. And that's because, as we'll see, they're going to attack by night. And this is part of a shock and awe tactic that the Israelites are going to employ. Now, what is the strategy? What is the strategy? Well, we just read that they are going to go to the outskirts of the encampment. If you look at the map on the back of your outlines, you can sort of see where the Midianite army is and where the Israelite army is. And they're kind of in a low, broad area, of course, because there's 135,000 men down there. And the Israelites were going to encircle this camp with their 300 men. And when Gideon and his 100 blew their trumpets, the rest of the 200 would also blow their trumpets and scream for Yahweh and for Gideon. And again, if you remember in the Bible, when you see the word Lord in all capitals, L-O-R-D, that's not referring to a title, but the covenant name of God. And so they are screaming two names, Yahweh and Gideon. Now, the point of adding Gideon's name to the battle cry is because, if you remember from last time, the Midianites had gotten wind that a man by the name of Gideon was coming to oppose them, and they were already afraid. Verse 14. Right? They're talking to us. This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. So already they are afraid of this name. So when they were to hear the name of Gideon called in the hills around them, that certainly would have instilled fear into them. Now, this is not really a battle strategy. I called, what is the battle strategy here? Well, you're going to take these men, you're going to go around the camp, and you're going to scream, blow trumpets, and as we'll see, wave some torches in the air. Now, that just sounds like something my boys would come up with as a battle strategy, right? That sounds like a lot of fun. Go up on a hill, get a trumpet, get something on fire, and just yell and scream. And yet, this is what the Lord is calling them to do. Like Jericho, when the Israelites first came into the promised land, they brought down those thick, gigantic walls in Jericho, not through strategy, not through superior firepower, but faithful obedience. As they marched around that city once a day for 7 days, and on the seventh day, marched around it 7 days. Blew their trumpets, the walls came down. And so the strategy here, again, is that same faithful obedience. Now, we've spoken much of how Gideon has been sort of a reluctant hero. He's needed a lot of goading. Could call him Gideon, I don't know. That just came to me. That wasn't a good joke. But he needed a lot of, nudging from the Lord and patience. If you remember, Gideon kept testing and testing and testing God, and God was very certain that Gideon, no, you're my man. And he kept really condescending himself to Gideon's constant questioning. But now we see really, truly faithful obedience. And in a way, we know it because we see his leadership. We know he's really believing now that God has called him to this because he has the confidence to say to these 300 men, look at me and do likewise. That is not a statement of arrogance, but of humility. That is him taking on the responsibility God has given to him and finally accepting it without excuses. Like Paul, when he told the Corinthians, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. That was not Paul trying to lift himself up above the Corinthians, rather to say he was just an instrument in God's hands. Paul was just being faithfully obedient, and so Corinthians, you too, be faithfully obedient. Gideon is saying, just as I am being faithfully obedient to the Lord, you also be faithfully obedient. Of course, Gideon cannot lead where he himself is not willing to go. So this is a sign. For him to say that is a sign that he is showing the faithful obedience he wants the others to manifest. And like many good commanders of soldiers, he's leading from the front. Now let's take a moment also to appreciate the faithful obedience of these 300 men. We talked last time that it's not explicitly stated that the different tests that they go through, except for the first one, when we whittled down the number of soldiers from 32,000 to 300. The first one was, talk about that a little bit later, if any of you are afraid, just go home. And it's like 20,000 plus of them went home. The rest were whittled down in a little bit more arbitrary ways, the main one being the one about kneeling, you remember? And drinking, whether they lap like a dog or whether they use their hand. Now, how does that translate to any kind of obedience? So I think we made the point last time that that may not have been anything about faithfulness or courage necessarily to go from the 10,000 to the 300. But it's clear in this moment, for sure, they are exhibiting faith. Maybe it is the case that the 300 were faithful to begin with, but we know for sure now that they are, because they've just been told to go to a camp of 135,000 men, just the 300 of you, with nothing but an empty jar with a torch and a trumpet. And they said, okay, they did it. There's no hint of hesitation. There's no seeming wavering in their conviction to go and obey. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says we walk by faith and not by sight. And these men who have known nothing but oppression for 7 years have been called by the Lord to do something which seems on the surface of it very illogical in terms of wartime strategy. And they said, I'm in. Let us commend them for their faithful obedience. Secondly, the strategy is don't panic. Or as we say in my house, panic is never the right answer. What happens next is that Gideon and the 300 men, they do exactly what they set out to do. And as the watch is changed over, the middle watch, which would have been that time, this would have taken place sometime between 10 and midnight. It says that at the beginning of the middle watch, they proceeded with their assault, if you can call it that. Now, why does it make specific mention that this is happening at the beginning of a guard shift? Well, it's a vulnerable time. The guard change is a vulnerable time for any army or force. That's when you have people coming off the line, coming on. There needs to be an exchange of information. There's a little bit of lack of clarity, as one person who's being held accountable for what's happening is coming out and another one's coming on. They need to be properly relieved, which means that there needs to be clear transaction. And it's just, there's a reason that is a good time to cause chaos. And we'll see in a minute that causing chaos and panic is part of how God is going to divinely intervene in this scenario. So it's not that they're doing completely impractical things as they go about this attack, but the key word here that we're going to see is that they're afraid, they're panicky, they run, they flee. This is chaos in a nutshell. The plan does go off without a hitch. And as we said just a moment ago, the Midianites were already on edge about what was going to happen. They're already expecting something bad. There's been bad dreams going around, bad omens. And so when the Israelites do lift up their voices and blow the trumpets and raise the torches, screaming a sword for Yahweh and for Gideon, panic and chaos ensue. Now, their response to what the Israelites do is both natural and supernatural. I'm reminded actually of the book of Exodus when it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart to Moses, who was asking for them to let go. So it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. On the other hand, it also says that the Lord hardened his heart. So here we're actually seeing a panic that, they're freaking out. But if a war correspondent were to interview, a survivor of the Midianite army, what happened that night? They may not make any reference to supernatural forces because they could certainly just attribute it to, we're terrified, we're on edge, there's fear, there's panic, it was dark, we heard, these tremendous sounds, and we saw all these lights, and we just freaked out. They might not reference anything in the divine. War is chaos, after all. But The text tells us there's more going on to their panic than just the chaos. This is divine psychological warfare, you could say. Yahweh's influence on the fight here in verse 22 is that he sets every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. In other words, they call this fratricide or friendly fire. They are starting to slaughter each other. Perhaps the Lord's influence here is just to turn their panic up to 11 that was already there, and that's all it took. Perhaps they just thought that the Israelites were in their camp. And this, if you read it, there's kind of an amassing of different armies there. And so maybe they didn't all look like your buddy. And so there was already a lot of unfamiliar faces and not knowing who was on whose side, and everyone just, waking up from being asleep, they just started to stab at anyone that didn't look familiar. Whatever was the case, the Lord was involved in how these men drew swords amongst themselves. You could say that their panic is God's hand of judgment against them. Even if God didn't have to ratchet anything up, God is allowing this to happen. God is the one who put them on edge, so to speak, so that their panic would overtake them. Sometimes God's judgment is just allowing you to suffer the consequences of your own worries and fears and bad judgment and mistakes. And God's judgment is just to let you feel the consequences of the situation you made for yourself. So it's attributed to God in any case, but certainly what's happening might very well have been, from our point of view, just an army in chaos, untrained, on edge. And I think there is something to learn in the negative about panic, that God's strategy for us is never to be like this. And again, in our household, I've said this for many years now, panic is never the right answer. There's no scenario, there's no situation where you can tell me that panic is the right thing to do. Sometimes running is the right thing to do. Sometimes screaming or crying out is the right thing to do. That's true. Sometimes fighting is the right thing to do. But the panic that we see here, that is never the right response for a believer. Why is that? Why is that? It's because God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. And one of my favorite passages actually about the end of the world is in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7 through 9. If anything should elicit panic, it's these words that Peter begins this passage with. 1 Peter 4:7, he says, "The end of all things is at hand." Right? Just imagine your favorite disaster movie where the world's coming to an end, right? And people are, just think about Costco when COVID started, and you get a little glimpse. That wasn't like world-ending cataclysm, but you saw some panic. Now just imagine if the end of the world really was at hand, and you know that the natural inclination is not too far off. I love disaster movies, and I love it because everybody knows what would happen in those moments where everyone is out for themselves, that kind of selfishness. And Peter says, the end of the world is at hand. Don't panic. He says, therefore, this is the opposite. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. When the world says the world is coming to an end, we see, storefronts burning, and we see cars crash into another. We see people looting in the streets. Those are the mental images that we have. But if the world, hopefully, were to see a Christian living in that same scenario, they would see someone that is self-controlled, sober-minded, still loving people, still showing hospitality. What do you do when you think the world's going to end? You hoard teepee, right? You get as much as you can for yourself. But what does Peter say? You keep showing hospitality to one another. Well, that is the difference between the Christian and the non-Christian. That should be the difference between us faced with a panic-inducing situation and the Midianites and the rest of the world when they face panic. It's a little bit of a stretch in terms of application, but I think it's fair to say that, again, panic is never the right strategy for the Christian. Even if the world was coming to an end, be self-controlled and sober-minded. Keep loving one another earnestly. Continue to show hospitality to one another. Don't panic. The strategy is never going to demand that we panic. Thirdly, the strategy is to show courage, even if you didn't the first time. Notice in verses 23 through 25 that as the Midianites are being routed, Gideon calls the men of Israel from Naphtali and from Asher and from Manasseh to go pursue the Midianites. And those are the tribes that were in that immediate region. Now, who are these men that Gideon is calling for? Probably the same 22,000 from the beginning of Judges 7 who said, oh, you're letting those who are afraid just go back home? 22,000 of them said, okay, yeah, they didn't know war. They've been oppressed by the Midianites. These men were probably not like professional soldiers, but rather just the young men of their tribes who had very little battle training, very little soldiering experience. And so perhaps you might say rightly, they said, yeah, I don't know what we're supposed to do here. I'm not a soldier. You're going to let me go? I'll go. Now these same men are likely the ones then that Gideon calls for. And they are, this time, willing to take up arms and go and catch those fleeing Midianites. You know, courage does not mean that you never show fear. Courage is just doing the right thing when you have the chance to. And while these soldiers may have lacked conviction and courage the first time around, they did not miss a second chance. Sometimes courage is just having the guts to say, yep, I screwed it up the first time, and I'm not going to let that happen again. I'm going to learn from that. And there is nothing wrong with finding courage from other people's faith and courage. In 1 Thessalonians 5:14, Paul calls believers to help the weak, encourage the faint-hearted, and admonish the idle, and to be patient with them all. He says in Romans 15:1 that those who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak. Sometimes you're the one that's strong and courageous. Sometimes you're the one that's weak and afraid. And so wherever you find yourself, it's okay, because God is thinking of you. You know, the church is there for you. If you're strong, then you bear with the failings of the weak. If you're weak, let those who are stronger help you and encourage you and get you to the place where you're able to help someone else. That is the mercy and the kindness of the Lord, to think of us that way, to give us a chance to do the right thing. And that is what matters, is that we would have the humility to do the right thing the next time. Maybe you screwed it up earlier today. Maybe just before you came to church, you blew up at your kids or your spouse, or you just had really a bad response, to a phone call that just really messed you up. Found out you lost your job or something, and you know that you reacted wrongly. Well, you're here. You're still drawing breath. God is saying you still have an opportunity to be courageous and do the right thing. You don't have to be defined by the thing that you just did. And God is often saying to us, do the right thing the next time. Whereas Satan would say, you're never going to get this right. Don't even try again. You screwed up once. That's all you are, is a failure. That's Satan's talk. That's a satanic temptation. Our strategy should be to always be of courage. And that just means do it right the next time then. When you have the chance, do it right then. We have mention here of two men who are called princes of Midian. And they're likely the sons or some of the sons of the king of Midian, Zeb and Oreb. They were also probably leading these armies, so they're like generals. And they are killed and captured. Certainly would have been a morale booster to the troops, and offering their head means that the battle and the war was theirs. So I know it's a little bit grotesque, right, to think of beheaded people, and we're going to come up to a little bit more of that at the end of 8, or in chapter 8. But this is to say that the strategy that the Lord employed was very successful. Such that they even captured and killed the generals. And this is something that would have, this is the custom in that time, in times of war. You would behead the general and you'd present it, to your general, and it was a sign that we've won. And so that's what's happening here. Now, lastly, the strategy is diplomacy. The beginning of chapter 8 is a little bit curious because all of a sudden, after the battle's over, you have the men of Ephraim who came in to join the fight there at the beginning of verse 24. Excuse me. And they're upset. They're upset. What is this you've done to us? Not to call us when you went to fight against Midian. Now, who is Ephraim? Ephraim is one of the largest tribes of Israel. They were centrally located, and they were somewhat protected from the conflicts because they lived in the hill country. They were involved in the campaigns that Ehud and Barak, the previous judges, had led, and so they've been on the right side a few times before. But here they seem to feel like that they were only called in when the Midianites might escape through Ephraim's territory. It seemed like they were not considered from the outset to join this fight against Midian. And yet, did they not know that battle and war was coming? Did they have really zero idea that the Midianites were amassing just right there on their doorstep? Were they unaware that Israel had mustered troops to come and face the Midianites? And where were they the past 7 years while Midian was oppressing Israel? Why did they not try to rise up against them any time during then? Was it really wounded pride here, or did they just think they're missing out on the loot of the victory or the glory? It's hard to say, but they are certainly hurt by this. And of course, in war, there's a lot of politicking. Nothing's changed from then till now. So what do you do if you're Gideon? Well, Gideon employs diplomacy. He suddenly is very savvy and has learned a lot in his experiences. He really seems to have a turnaround here in these verses. He goes from being a somewhat reluctant hero and not savvy about leading to being very good at leadership, and here even dealing with his brothers, the Ephraimites, in an understanding way. Or as Proverbs 15:1 tells us, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And so he responds to them very graciously. And I'm going to here just quote a commentator, Block, who does a great job of analyzing this. And I could just paraphrase it, or I could just quote him. So here I think it's just helpful to quote him. This is his observation. Gideon offers a four-dimensional response. First, with the rhetorical question, he minimizes his own role in comparison with theirs. What have I done now in comparison with you? Second, he flatters the tribe of Ephraim with a proverb, also cast as a rhetorical question, but expecting a positive answer. In other words, the vintage of Abiezer, which is the clan that Gideon belongs to, is insignificant compared to the gleaning of Ephraim. And so, this is my comment. In other words, Gideon is saying, listen, your scraps are better than the best that my little tribe has to offer. I'm not even trying to compare myself to you. To continue the quote. To change the metaphor, the best the Ebiezrites can produce is less than the scraps off the Ephraimites' table. The proverb has the ring of a clever political slogan. Third, he acknowledges that God has rewarded their contribution by giving them the real trophies, the Midianite commanders, Oreb and Zeeb. Fourth, he minimizes his personal role a second time, though with greater intensity. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? So all of a sudden, he is very diplomatic. And when it comes to our life, when it comes to our strategy and how we deal with life, when it comes to the enemies of God, there can be faithful obedience, there can be avoiding panic, there can be a call to courageousness and confront those who come against us. But when it comes to our friends in the church, our brothers and sisters in Christ, notice how the tone very quickly switches to very conciliatory. We don't bring the same strategies of destroying and beheading our enemies to those within the body of Christ and within the church. Sometimes people treat other Christians worse than they treat the enemies of God. And there's been some examples of this even relatively recently where a very prominent pastor gave some advice regarding whether to attend like a transsexual or a grandchild's marriage to a transsexual person. And obviously, that's a very contentious sort of issue, and it's very well known, prominent pastor. You can Google it if you want. He gave some advice that many may not agree with. And in the sphere now of social media and access to the opinions of every person that's breathing and has a pulse, this stirred up a firestorm. And many people have given less than charitable responses. And I'm not saying that I happen to agree with this particular pastor's response to the issue, but the responses to the response. I've seen Christians treat their enemies better than they have treated this man who has in all other ways been very faithful in many, many years of ministry. In terms of the Christian family, there's a lot to say for our strategy to be diplomatic, to care about being on good terms with those who we really are banding with to, fight against the true enemies of God. And even when we say the enemies of God, realize that our enemy is spiritual. A person is not our enemy per se. We are trying to win the lost. We are trying to reap a harvest of souls in preaching the gospel. Every person we meet, we hope and long for them to come and turn to Christ. But we understand that we live in a world that is cursed and tainted by sin, that Satan is certainly using people and tempting them to do his will and to perpetuate his agenda. So we live in that tension where we do have enemies. At the same time, we want to see them won for Christ. At the same time, we want to deny any effort to come against the Lord. And we want to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. But certainly, amongst the people of God and those who profess Christianity, there should be some charitableness, some diplomacy, some willingness, because we must fight together and not against each other, to, like Proverbs says, as we just read, to bring a soft answer, especially when there's a temptation to wrath. In 2 Chronicles 14:11, King Asa is facing an Ethiopian army of 1 million men and 300 chariots. He has in his force 580,000, which is not too bad, but when you're looking at 1 million men, it might seem a little bit paltry. This is his prayer before he enters the battle. And I think this is a good way just to close out our thoughts on this. 2 Chronicles chapter 14. verse 11. And Asa cried to Yahweh his God, O Yahweh, there is none like you to help between the mighty and the weak. Help us, O Yahweh our God, for we rely on you. And in your name we have come against this multitude. O Yahweh, you are our God. Let not man prevail against you. And just in one verse, sums up, so Yahweh defeated the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. That's a very simple prayer of faithful obedience. He was tempted, I am sure, to be in a panic. Again, a 1,000,000-man army, that is intimidating. But rather than panic, he cries out to Yahweh, not in fear, but in courageous trust. Please, God, do this. It is our own. We are here not to win a battle, but just for your name's sake. And so be with us as we go into this war. And so, just to leave us with that prayer, if you're a Christian here tonight, every day is a struggle and a battle, isn't it? We are facing temptations from within our own hearts. The enemy is right here, but the enemy is also at our doorstep. The enemy is also the world. It can certainly feel intimidating, much more intimidating than facing a 1,000,000-man army. But as Joshua discovered back in the book of Joshua, if we are on the Lord's side, we don't have anything to fear. And so if you're not a Christian tonight, you're not on the Lord's side. You could have 1,000,000 men with you. You could have 8 billion people in your corner. But against God and his holiness, there's no victory. And instead, what this God did, rather than overcome you and conquer you, he sent his own son in what looked like loss, in what looked like a victory of the forces of evil. He sent his son to die on a cross. But when the perfect Son of God went on the cross, it was not because of anything wrong he had done, but as a payment, a propitiation for our sins, and as a substitution where we should have been the ones stricken by a holy God for all the sins that we have committed. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, took that punishment from God, the wrath of God, took our place on the cross so that we could be made friends of God, so it could be said that we are on the Lord's side, so that we don't have to fear what comes, and so that we can have a strategy that far exceeds the plans and purposes of the world around us, that no government or dictator could ever supersede. The Lord is on our side. The Lord can be on your side too. So if you're not a Christian tonight and you have any questions about what any of this means, we'd love to talk with you about that tonight.